Hi everyone, welcome to the TLDR video for week 2, Introduction to Linux. This week the objectives are going to focus on being able to list distros and explain some differences, be able to start doing your labs in the case of Northern Essex students logging onto the server. You should also start working with some file structure, common directories, and most importantly, start working on how to get help when you need help. We can start by talking about Linux families. Now, there are actually 3 operating system families in the world: Windows, Mac, and Linux. This class is obviously going to be focusing on Linux. One of the things that makes Linux very different from a lot of other operating systems is the amount of variants or distros or flavors that are out there. What you can see looking at this slide is actually a short history of the different Linux families, color-coded by open source, closed source, or mixed. What you can see in the graphic on the right is the example of complexity. A lot of people think that there's only 1 or 2 flavors of Linux, not hundreds. And there is actually a significant amount of flavors or distros, especially when you compare it to something more straightforward like Windows, where Windows might only have 2 or 3 active versions. Linux might very reasonably have 100 active versions that people are developing for different reasons. Now, if we wanted to do a little bit of a zoom in onto Ubuntu, Ubuntu is one of the more popular kernels. The Ubuntu kernel actually has multiple flavors. So what happened was the regular base Ubuntu kernel, and there's also the people that just use straight Ubuntu. But some people will actually take that kernel and give it a different wrapper or a different look to it, depending on what they want out of their operating system. So for example, you might see something like Kubuntu or Xubuntu, and those are actually different wrappers for the Ubuntu kernel, but they are still technically Ubuntu variants. Now, the Linux family resemblance. Some of the main distributions include Fedora, Arch, SUSE, Mint, Ubuntu, Red Hat, and Debian. Now, these are all going to be different kernels. And the main variations that you're going to end up seeing is how installs are done, where files are located and which files are here by default, the software that is included, and also the primary usage. For example, Linux Mint you might end up using if you are a beginner because they are trying to make everything as easy as possible for you, versus something like Red Hat you're going to be using because you would like to have an incredibly secure server that's really well supported. Now, Linux users, we might end up having novice Linux users, which if you've never used Linux before, I would recommend Ubuntu or Mint. They are generally a little bit more user friendly and there's more documentation. What I would consider an advanced user is somebody who wants to do something very special purpose. For example, you would like to run a server, or you would like to get into the security field and start doing some pen testing, in which case you would need to use Kali. Or perhaps you are worried about privacy, in which case you would want to use cubes. And those different flavors can give you different pre-packaged software, and it will come with a different setup. Now, the labs that you're going to be doing is going to be on the CIS server unless you have your very own virtual machine or you run Linux at home. Some things that you want to be careful of when you are logging on for labs. You want to make sure that you're using SSH and SCP. If you are running Windows, which is probably a lot of you, I would recommend PuTTY and WinSCP. You want to make sure that you pay attention to case as you are typing in your username and password. You want to make sure that you're really careful when you are typing in your password. Nothing is going to happen when you type in your password. So when you are doing an SSH into a new server, or anytime you SSH into a server, your password isn't going to show up. You're not going to see the characters, you're not going to see the little star signs, also known as splats. It's going to look like nothing is happening. You have to just type and trust. In the case of usernames and passwords, for those of you that will be logging on to the CIS server, it's really important that you don't lose your username and password because you're going to be using them for labs for the whole term. Now, normally, if we were able to get into the classroom, we actually have some local Linux for you to use as well so that you can see what that looks like versus the server. But as of fall 2020 and the pandemic, none of us are allowed on campus. After you've logged in, what you want to do is start playing around with some basic commands. I've created a video called Basic Linux Commands FAQ that you can go through if you would like some help with that. Start playing around with things like ls and cd, see what's there, maybe create some files, start navigating around the system, and just start playing with it. Remember, the absolute worst thing that can happen is you log in again, or if you get horrendously lost in the system, CD enter is home sweet home. Now, if you end up needing help, there's the manual or man pages. There's web resources that I've put in Blackboard. If you are a Northern Essex student, then we have some tutoring available. The schedule will be posted to Blackboard once I get it. I also have a required book that's the Linux Pocket Guide. This is not the kind of book that you want to read cover to cover. Start getting used to the index at the back of the book and using it as a reference. If you have any questions, please let me know.